Hi everyone, welcome. This is the webinar for the Literacy Tutoring Network, and we are going to be focusing on the year-end data dive. We are approaching the end of the school year, and I know you're in the process of either collecting or finalizing your data from the 2015-2016 school year. And this webinar is meant to help you do a dive into that data and learn from it. The purpose of this webinar is to help us focus on data as a strategy. The network selected both racial equity as a strategy to focus on, as well as using data to help inform the work that we do individually as programs and also together as a network. We really feel that we can use our assessment data individually as programs and also together as a network to learn from how this year has gone and to help interpret the information to use it for improvement purposes as a network and also as individual programs. This webinar will help us do that and will provide examples and tips to help you explore the data with your staff as a program. Just want to go over a few expectations before we dive in. All of the data you will see is made up. Because of student data privacy laws, we will not be using actual data. The data is based on literacy assessments, and you will probably recognize the assessment numbers when you see them, but they are all made up student numbers and fake information related to dosage and the other pieces that we're going to look at today. I also want to point out that this webinar and the information that you'll get and the templates you get are really meant to serve as a guide. These are not explicitly aligned with your exact programming or exact assessments. It's to give you ideas of how you could apply some of these strategies and these tools within your own program to better dive into your data and to understand it. Finally, another last thing I want to make sure to say is that when looking at data like this, it's important to remember the difference between correlation and causation. So correlation is when two things happen to correlate or happen to be related to one another. It does not necessarily mean that one of those variables actually causes the other to occur. So for example, you may notice a correlation between the amount of dosage a student receives in literacy tutoring, and you may also realize then a matching pattern with whether they had high growth or not. And that is really important to look at and to understand, but it is also important to note that you may not be able to know whether that actually caused the increased dosage, actually caused an increase in growth. And so it's really important to know that this is not necessarily a scientific way of looking at causation, but the correlations are important to help inform what you know in your program. And that information can help you when you bring your personal experience with your program and you bring your information that you know about individual students into that. You can make your best estimates as to what's happening to be able to learn and move forward in terms of improvement and making decisions about what to change and what to continue doing within your program. Okay, we're going to start by looking at a sample Excel data sheet and go through the data sheet and the various variables that are included. Then I will walk through some Excel functions to get you all familiar with some of the functions we will use to manipulate the data sheet. And then I will show some examples of some different ways of looking at the data. So to start, I'm going to go through each of these sample spreadsheets. There are two tabs, and the first example is a relatively high-level sheet. So here we have the student number listed. Traditionally, in your own spreadsheets, you would have likely maybe a student number, but also a student first and last name. In this case, because this is a sample data sheet of fake data, there are no student names. I do encourage you, however, if you do in your own spreadsheets, use student first and last name to also include a student number. The student number is useful for when you want to resort your data. You can always go back to the original list that you had in the original order, and you can use this random student number to be able to resort the data. In addition, if you ever want to de-identify the data and remove the student names for some reason within your staff or within your organization, you could do that, and you could always then rematch up the students based on the student number to the students as long as you kept a key with that information. So then you'll see in this first spreadsheet, we have some demographic information about students. We have their gender, race, their EL status, so their English learner status, their grade, and what school or site they participated in. In addition, we have information about their literacy tutoring. So we have the number of hours of literacy tutoring that they received throughout the year. And then we have whether they achieved the literacy benchmark in the spring and whether they achieved the fall to spring growth target that was set for the student. So one helpful hint when using Excel is that it is very useful to use the dynamic of ones and zeros. It's a binary for most of your variables that have an option of yes, this student has this characteristic, or no. That's called a binary variable. And in this case, I put ones and zeros for whether the student achieved the literacy benchmark in the spring, and a 0 indicates no, and a 1 indicates yes. And for this column I have, did the student achieve the growth target for the year? A 1 indicates yes, a 0 indicates no. You will find later that the 1-0 setup helps you with sorting and counting and calculating percentages. So it makes it a lot easier for you to understand and manipulate your data as you go. Over some features that we will use, most of them are found under the Data tab. So here you'll see the Data tab is up here in your menu. The functions that we will use most commonly will be these two functions, sort and filter. So let's start with filter. It's probably the most straightforward. To turn on the filter function, you click and it will enable filtering. And essentially what it assumes is that your top row is the title of each of your categories. And you'll click on one of, if you want to filter for one of your columns, you can click and you'll see all the various options that are available. So we, at this program, in this sample data set, there are 3 different sites. And they're all schools. This is a school-based program. So you'll see Eastern Heights Elementary is one of the sites, Farnsworth, Aerospace, and Riverview. So if you just wanted to look at one site, you could click Eastern Heights. I want to filter so that only Eastern Heights is showing. Click OK. And then you'll see here that it's going to filter out all of the other data. And this is a quick, easy way to be able to manipulate the spreadsheet to calculate various things. The next function I want to show you is a shortcut of finding averages and finding sums. So I have filtered under Eastern Heights, and let's say I want to know how many of my kids achieved the literacy benchmark at Eastern Heights Elementary. I can highlight this row, and down below here on this bar, you will notice that there's some shortcuts of sums and counts that are automatically calculated. So count is the total number of data points that have been entered. So it's going to count up 1s, 0s, any number, any information that's been entered in that column. So you can see here that 50 students in total, 50 data points are in this selection that I have. That means that I have 50 students in total that are at the Eastern Heights Elementary School site. Now the sum is going to add them all up. And this is where the benefit of 1s and 0s come in. So 0 means that the students did not achieve the spring literacy benchmark. 1 means that the student did. Well, when you add up the total here, all the 1s are going to add to 19. So that means 19 of the students at Eastern Heights, that's the sum, achieved the spring literacy benchmark. So I can quickly calculate a percentage of 19 over 50 to figure out what the percentage of students is that achieved the literacy benchmark. So you could do that on a calculator. You could do that in a separate spreadsheet. You could also just do it directly in here. And 19 over 50. So 38%, and I can turn that directly into a percentage if I want to. So 38% of the students at Eastern Heights achieve the spring literacy benchmark. Okay. And to turn off filtering, I can either go back to the column that I was filtering from and hit select all, just like that. Or, let's go back. I can just go back to the data function and click filter, and it will actually turn the filtering off altogether. So whenever you want to turn the filtering on or off, you just click the filter button. And you could do the same thing here under any of these columns. So I could say I only want to see the students that achieve the literacy benchmark across all of my sites. I could highlight them here, and the sum and the count are going to be the same because there's no zeros. And that means of my 100 kids in my program, 33 of the students achieved the spring literacy benchmark. So 33 of 100, that's 33% in total. So going back to my calculation for Eastern Heights, their average was 38%, so I know that's slightly higher than the program overall. Okay, so that's filtering. We're going to use that more throughout the webinar, but for now, that's just an overview. I'm going to turn the filter feature off. And now I'll show you sort. So sorting is a really great way to look at all of your data, but to sort it by a certain criteria. So as long as your clicker, your mouse, is within the chart and you click the sort button, it will highlight the entire table. And basically what you can do is you can select different variables to sort by. So in this example, I could sort by grade, smallest to largest, hit OK, and you'll notice here that starting with first grade, then goes to second grade, and so on. One thing to note is that K is a letter, so it'll come after the numbers. Just be aware of that when sorting. But let's say in addition to sorting by grade, I also want to then sort by dosage. So by each grade, I want to find out which students received the highest dosage in each grade. And you can either do largest to smallest, smallest to largest. Here I'm going to go largest to smallest because I'm looking at dosage and I want to see highest dosage. So you'll notice here that it's still sorting by grade. So first grade is first. And then it's going to be in descending order for dosage. So in first grade, the highest dosage was 38 hours of tutoring, literacy tutoring. In second grade here, the students with the highest dosage got 40.5 hours. Looking here at third grade, the highest dosage was 38.5, and so on. Now with sorting, once you've sorted, there's really no way other than hitting back to go back to the original way your data was sorted in, unless you have something like the student number. And that's one reason why some people like to have this ID. So the initial data set was sorted by student number. So if I want to go back, I can delete the ways that it was sorted, and I can go back and say student number, smallest to largest, OK, and it will return to the initial structure of the spreadsheet. Okay. Now I'm going to show you the second spreadsheet here. This is a little bit more detailed. And so for some programs, they may just want to include whether the basic student demographics and whether they achieved the benchmark or not, and whether they achieved their growth benchmark or not. But in some cases, people may want to actually look at the actual scores. So in this case, this spreadsheet here, I am using the reading CBM assessments. So these are scores that students received on the reading CBM. And in here, in addition to the demographic information, the total dosage, I have their raw scores entered. So I have the fall reading CBM score. I have the spring reading CBM score, and then I've used formulas to calculate how much growth they had and then whether they achieved the benchmark or whether they achieved their growth target. So this is going to be just a quick introduction into how to do some formulas within Excel because they're useful when using such a spreadsheet. So these raw scores were simply entered for each student, their data from the fall assessment period and their data from the spring assessment period was entered by hand. Here, this is the change from fall to spring. So basically what we want to do is we want to take their spring score, subtract the fall score, and calculate how much growth they had. So what I simply did is created a formula. And in Excel, when you create a formula, it always starts with an equal sign. And in this case, I'm saying the change in fall to spring equals I2, which is the spring score, minus H2, which is the fall score. And it will automatically calculate. And then the great thing about Excel is that you can drag this down and it will automatically calculate that for every single one of these students. So this is the change from fall to spring. To calculate the benchmarks and the growth target, you do need to add some information. So this data is based on Ames Web norms. And here you can see I've entered the spring benchmark target. So if you go to Ames Web Norms for 2014-2015, the spring benchmark target for 4th grade is 139. So what I did to enter this information is I actually filtered by grade and then entered in the targets for each of the grade in the spring. And once the targets are entered, you're then able to determine whether each individual student achieved the spring benchmark using a formula. And this type of formula is called an if formula. So basically what this formula is saying is if, so start with the equal sign just like any formula, if, open parentheses, if I2, if the spring score is greater than or equal to K2, which is the spring benchmark. So if the spring score is greater than or equal to the spring benchmark, then put a 1. If not, put a 0. So what essentially is that's saying is if the student's spring score is greater than the benchmark, greater than or equal to the benchmark target, then the student will get a 1 in that column to indicate that that student achieved the spring benchmark. If not, it will be a 0. So this formula then uses all of this populated information to calculate whether the student achieves the spring benchmark or not. Here, we have the fall to spring growth target. So this again is like the spring benchmark target where it's simply entered. And this is going to depend on whether you use the fall to spring growth targets that are in the norms or whether you use one that you set yourself as a program for the individual student. Here I calculated the norms at 50% growth. So these were entered in, and then this is very similar and also an if formula to determine whether the student achieved the benchmark. So in this case, always start with an equal sign. Then it's going to be the if formula, open parentheses, if J2, if the change from fall to spring, if that growth score is greater than or equal to M, the fall to spring growth target, then we're going to put a 1. If not, put a 0. So that formula is going to calculate whether this number is greater than this number. And in this case, 44, the growth the student made from fall to spring, is greater than the growth target of 32, so that student gets a 1 there. So obviously this can be done within Excel. You can export your data and you can calculate this information. You could also pull reports or look up the students individually within a data system, and you could simply enter 1 or 0s like they are in this spreadsheet as well. So these are multiple options depending on what makes sense for your program. One other tip within Excel that can be helpful is, as you can see, as I moved over here and looked at some of this information and started looking at growth targets and scores, you can see that I lost sight of the other information on students. And some people like to be able to see the student that they're referencing as they're looking at the data. So there's a feature called freezing panes that can help you do that. So essentially, wherever you want to freeze your panes, you put your cursor and select that cell. So in this case, I want to be able to see the student row, or in your case it may be a student name. I want to be able to see the student's name, or who the student is. And then I also want to just be able to see the top row all the time, because as I scroll down, I want to be able to see what variable I'm looking at. So in this case, I'm going to put my cursor here. I'm going to go up to View, and I'm going to select Freeze Panes. And you'll notice that those bars show up to indicate what's frozen. So as I move over, I can still see the student number. And as I scroll down, you can still see the variables up top. So that's just a trick that can help make it easier for you as you're going through and playing with your data. We can go back and we can do that same thing here. This is where I want it to freeze, freeze panes, and there we go. Okay. So now I'm going to go through some examples of how you can slice and dice your data to be able to have discussions amongst your staff about what you can learn from the data and what patterns you're noticing. So I'm going to work from this spreadsheet, and the first thing I'm going to look at is dosage. So one thing that's interesting is to simply figure out what is the average dosage of a student in my program. So a quick and easy way to figure that out is to simply highlight the entire dosage column. So I am highlighting all 100 students in my program, and I'm highlighting their dosage. And you can come down here for the shortcut, and the average student has a dosage of 22.6 hours. That is the average dosage of these 100 students in my program. If you want to sort by dosage and look at how growth or benchmark achievement varies by dosage, you could go under Data, Sort, as we did before, and instead of sorting by student number, select Total Literacy Dosage, and we're going to go largest to smallest. In some programs, they have a cutoff to say a student is considered tutored when they reach a certain amount of hours. So one example could be you have a goal of all students who are considered tutored receiving 10 or more hours. So sorting could be an easy way for you to figure out how many of those students did not achieve that 10-hour minimum. So in this case, we have 13 students that did not achieve that minimum. And then you can select the others that do. And you have 87, and their average overall is 24.8 hours. So it's just an easy way to figure out some quick numbers and averages for the students that you're serving. Now let's use some filtering to be able to learn more about the students that we're serving. So let's say you want to look specifically at English language learner students. So here I can filter and select one, because I want all of my students who are receiving English language learner services to be highlighted within the spreadsheet to show up. So I can highlight them here, and I can see that 38 of my 100 students are designated EL students. Now let's say I want to learn something about them. Let's say I want to see, is there a pattern for the grade level of EL students? So for example, how many EL students do I have at each grade? Well, in this case, you can see I have 6 students in the first grade that are designated EL students. So that's a relatively small number. But in second grade, you can see I have 18 students total. So I have a large number of my students that are EL students. A large portion of them are in second grade. That could tell me something about where I need to focus my specialized interventions for EL students, because a number of them are in second grade. I have a handful in third, a couple in fourth, 1 in fifth, and several in kindergarten. So this is just an easy way to be able to filter and understand how your students, how their demographics are falling across grades. Because the focus of the Literacy Tutoring Network is on racial equity, I also think it's really important to look at patterns by race and gender. In this case, let's look at the combination of race and gender. So let's pull up African American students, which are number 4 in the St. Paul Public Schools data variable. And let's look at African American males. So we can take a look at their data. Here we have 4 of the 14 students that are African American males in our program achieving the literacy benchmark, and 8 of the 14 having achieved their growth target. We can look at their average dosage. So it's 19.4, and you'll notice that that average dosage is lower than the average for the overarching program this last year. Another thing that may be of interest is to sort by dosage itself and see how many of the students have less than 10 hours. This is something that we're interested in. So that's a really low number. So here we have 4 of the 14 students that are receiving less than 10 hours. 4 of the 14 African American males are receiving less than 10 hours of tutoring. That is about 29% of them. And if we look at our overall data set, so let's turn off the filter and let's sort by dosage. $13 of 100, so 13%. So that's a pretty big difference. We have 13% of our overall data set in our students in our program. 13% of students in our program are receiving less than 10 hours of tutoring in a year. But of the African American males, it's actually almost 30% of those students. So that might be something worth looking into to figure out what's going on with dosage and why is the dosage for African American males lower? Does it have something to do with the way behavior standards are being implemented in schools? Does it have something to do with attendance? You may want to look into the data, the other sources of data that you have to help inform that. Okay. So another useful way of looking at the information is, do you see differences across schools or across sites? So in this case, this is a school-based program, so the sites are school sites. And here we can look at the differences across the 3 sites. So let's filter. Let's start by filtering. And let's start by looking at Eastern Heights Elementary. So at Eastern Heights Elementary, I'm going to focus in on the benchmark. At Eastern Heights Elementary, we have 50 students, and 19 of the 50 achieved the spring benchmark. That is about 38% of the students achieved the spring benchmark this year. Okay. Then let's look at Riverview. So at Riverview, 4 of the 21 students achieved their spring literacy benchmark. That's 19%. So we have 19% achieving their literacy benchmark at Riverview and 38% at Eastern Heights. So it's something to maybe look into to know, what do you know about your student population at Riverview? Are you serving students that are further behind? Maybe you could look at their growth rates and how many are achieving their growth targets. What do you know about the quality of your programming at those different sites? How is it being implemented? And this is a way to be able to learn from the data, and by looking at the data across different schools and sites. You could do the same thing for grade level. You could do the same thing across genders. You could slice and dice the data in a lot of different ways to be able to facilitate a conversation across your staff. So that was an example of how to set up a spreadsheet and use Excel to look at different patterns within your data and to have a conversation with your staff about what you're learning using your assessment data. Here are some guiding questions that you can use to help facilitate a conversation with your staff. For example, what correlations or combinations of data are you interested in? What patterns do you notice? What surprises you? What are you proud of? How does the data compare to previous years? Or how does the data compare to your experience this year? What challenges do you see in the data? We encourage you to use these questions to have a conversation with your team. The next steps are to export your data if you use a data set and prepare it in a spreadsheet similar to the ones we have. We will provide the Literacy Tutoring Network template that was used in this webinar for your use. We encourage you to examine the data with your team, have multiple eyes on it, give people an opportunity to look at it individually, but then also together, have conversation about it, and note any observations or questions you have. At the June 23rd meeting, we will discuss in program teams and also as a network and share what you've learned and what questions you have. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to any of the Foundation staff. We can help support you through this process, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.